The aim of this presentation is to provide you with a background to climate change monitoring and evaluation. The presentation will introduce you to international principles of climate change monitoring and evaluation, and will also provide you with an overview of the monitoring and evaluation systems that have been used nationally for climate change and in the Rural Human Settlements Adaptation Strategy. First of all, what are we talking about when we use the term monitoring and evaluation, or M&E? Monitoring can be defined as the continuous collection of information to check whether an intervention is on track or achieving a set of objectives. Evaluation, on the other hand, can be defined as an assessment of an intervention at a particular point in time, such as assessing whether a policy has achieved its objectives. The aim or purpose of an M&E in climate adaptation is to assist us with tracking the progress of adaptation interventions and assessing the effectiveness of the interventions in reducing vulnerability and improving adaptive capacity. A monitoring and evaluation system can also help with identifying and prioritizing good practice interventions and removing those that are less effective. Furthermore, at a national level, the outputs of an M&E system can be used to feed into international reporting requirements, such as the national adaptation plans required by the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC. Monitoring and evaluation systems are implemented at different levels, including international, national, and project level. At an international level, international conventions and agencies focus on assessing a collection of projects against global targets. At a national level, national governments assess the effectiveness of national intervention in reducing vulnerability and adapting to change against national targets. At a project or program level, local governments, communities, and NGOs assess the effectiveness of projects in reducing vulnerability and adapting to change. There isn't a set M&E framework you should use for climate change programs. However, there are a number of M&E frameworks that are used internationally that apply similar principles to M&E. A useful summary of the different principles you can apply in climate change M&E frameworks can be found in the Climate Eval Community of Good Practice report. Some of the key principles highlighted in this report are that you define your focus areas that you would like to monitor. You then need to develop a set of indicators to measure progress and identify the data that is required to measure the indicator and the sources required. When you develop your M&E framework, you should also identify the institutional requirements and the funding that is required to implement your M&E system. In South Africa, the development of a national monitoring and evaluation system was identified as a requirement in the National Climate Change Response White Paper and the National Development Plan. The M&E system would help to track progress with the transition towards a low-carbon and climate-resilient society. A lower-carbon society and economy is one where emissions are reduced to sustainable levels and economic development is not dependent on fossil fuel-based energy. A climate-resilient society and economy is one where we are able to adapt to change. Based on the requirements of the NDP and the National Climate Change Response Plan, two complementary climate change monitoring and evaluation systems were developed. The first is the Climate Change Response M&E System, and the second is the GHG Inventory System. The GHG Inventory System collates greenhouse gas emission information from different organizations, sectors, and land uses. It makes use of an online system, the South African Air Quality Information System, to collect this data, and out of this data, a GHG inventory report is produced. This can be used for reporting internationally on carbon emissions. The second is the Climate Change Response M&E System, which collates all the other climate change information. This includes information on adaptation and climate finance and uses the GHG Inventory System as a source of data on GHG emissions. The Climate Change Response M&E System also makes use of an online platform to collect information and produces an annual climate change report. The rest of this presentation will focus on the Climate Change Response M&E System. The Climate Change M&E System can be broken up into the following 5 sections. Monitoring, which includes the identification of a data and information network to access information on climate change from different stakeholders, as well as the development of a web-based database to collect the information collected. The second section is evaluation, which involves analyzing the information collected through the use of indicators. The third section in the M&E system is guidance, which includes a set of M&E guidelines to assist with the collection and analysis of data. The fourth section is on outputs. These are all the different outputs that are produced using the results from the evaluation process, which include reports to the UNFCCC. The fifth and final section is on feedback, learning and review, and involves ensuring that procedures are regularly reviewed and updated. There are 2 main objectives of the South Africa's Climate Change Response M&E system, which are to track South Africa's transition to a lower carbon economy and to track the transition to a climate-resilient society and economy. We are now going to look at the monitoring and evaluation systems that have been developed to measure each of the main objectives of the Climate Change Response M&E system, which was identified earlier. The first objective is to track the transition to a lower carbon economy. A tiered approach has been developed that identified a set of indicators to track emissions reduction information at 3 different tiers. These are Tier 1, country level, Tier 2, sectoral, sub-sectoral, and company level, and Tier 3, response measure level. It is worth noting that tracking the transition to a climate-resilient society is more challenging than tracking the transition to a low-carbon society. This is partly due to the long timescales associated with climate change adaptation, and that there are no agreed to metrics when measuring the effectiveness of climate adaptation responses. South Africa's Climate Change Response M&E system identifies 3 building blocks to track the transition to a climate-resilient society. These include climate information, climate risks, impacts and vulnerability, and adaptation response measures. Each of these blocks has a set of key elements that identifies the type of monitoring and evaluation that is required for each block. The key elements required to monitor and evaluate climate resilience in South Africa are identified as development of indicators for monitoring and evaluating the transition to a climate-resilient society, mapping the state of knowledge under each indicator, tracking the progress in implementation under each indicator, and evaluating the effectiveness of the activities undertaken. The Department of Environmental Affairs has also developed a set of desired adaptation outcomes, or DAOs. These were developed to assist with the monitoring and evaluation of South Africa's progress in moving towards a climate-resilient society. These DAOs are outcomes to be achieved in the future that would result in South Africa being climate resilient. The DAOs were developed from the sector-specific adaptation priorities that are identified in the National Climate Change Response White Paper. There are 10 DAOs that have been identified. Some of these include robust policies, programs and actions for climate change adaptation, appropriate processes and mechanisms for coordinating climate change adaptation, accurate weather forecasting, reliable seasonal predictions, climate projections and effective early warning systems, and capacity building, education, and awareness programs for climate change adaptation. Now let's have a look back at what the Climate Change Adaptation Sector Strategy for Rural Human Settlements says about monitoring and evaluation. The strategy includes an M&E framework which describes a set of indicators and activities for each of its 7 objectives. The framework also includes means of verification information and any assumptions made when developing the indicators. This slide shows the details of the first objective, which is support the development of community and local climate adaptation plans. This presentation has provided you with an introduction to the principles of monitoring and evaluation, the National Climate Change M&E systems and processes, and the Rural Human Settlements M&E framework. The next presentation will help you to develop your own climate change M&E framework.